I'm sure more members will be coming in. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to be introducing my friend Arunava Sinha to this audience tonight. He'll talk about Habar Jabber Law, a nonsense adventure, his translation of Sukumari's Hojabarala. Given the unique and quintessentially Bengali humor of Ray's work, this would have been a very courageous, if not daunting, thing to attempt for almost any translator that one can think about, but probably not as much for Arunava, who has translated all our greats from Rabindranath Tagore and very many in between and beyond. He's particularly known for his translations of modern and contemporary Bengali authors. He has won a number of awards for his translations and is presently Associate Professor of Practice and Creative Writing at Ashoka University. Let me read out excerpts from just 2 reviews before handing over to him. From Live Mint, Chilo Rumal Hoye Gelo Beral. It was a handkerchief that's turned into a cat. Bengalis of a certain vintage will get a fuzzy feeling about their childhood when they read that line from Hojabarala, Sukumari's seminal book of nonsense literature published in 1921. It's populated with characters like a talking raven who keeps accounts. There's a goat that gives jumbled up speeches. An old man with a flowing beard argues that he's 13 years old. Now, a new English translation that takes that child's befuddlement to a wider audience, giving Ray's fantastical world a global touch. Habar Jabber Law has Arunava Sinha capturing the humor with lines like, "There is no such thing as a ledge dog. Pick it up for a window into the mind of the man who was Satyajit Ray's father. The book might make you purr in delight." The second review from the Deccan Chronicle, Arunava Sinha's translation manages to keep the language accessible while preserving the intricate use of wordplay and the satirical undertone for which the original is renowned. Sinha's version of the names of characters is especially noteworthy since he manages to retain the original intention while contextualizing the allusions to more relevant references. The names also add flair and comedic value to the book. This is the 4th or probably the 5th of our virtual talks, so I'm sure that you know how these things go. The audience will remain muted and will have a chance to ask questions at the end of the talk when I shall prompt. Over to you, Arunava.
Thank you, Shrajesh, and good evening to all the members of Calcutta Club and anyone else who might be here. Very kind of you to have me here this evening. Thank you so much. And Shrajesh, once more, thank you for your very kind words in your introduction. You mentioned the words courageous. I think I would prefer to say reckless, because really translating Sukumari is a reckless act, not least because not only are there legends of people who will protect his heritage, but also because I am probably the toughest person to please, or one of the toughest to please when it comes to Sukumari, because like many people of our generation, we have grown up on Sukumari, revering him for his iconoclastic, his attitude and his refusal to kowtow to authority of any kind, and to be supremely contemptuous of anybody who appears to be throwing their weight around. So he was our guru, our role model. And to actually say that I am now going to present Sukumari to a different audience is really, it's foolhardy almost. And I don't think I would have got around ever to translating this book for an audience, although I've done little snippets here and there, had it not been for the editor of this book, Sudeshna from Speaking Tiger, who runs their young imprint and Talking Cub. And she sort of told me, why don't you just translate it? And I think I was hoping for someone who would not take no for an answer, which turned out to be her, luckily. And she insisted that you must do it. And I said, no, I can't do this. There are very eminent translators who have done this already, including the great Shukanto Chaudhuri, whom I absolutely worship as a translator, and indeed who has translated Abul Tabul in a way that I don't think any other translator can match. And perhaps it is not even necessary to attempt that again. But nevertheless, I've also maintained that every new generation needs a new translation of the great works because their own language changes. And because Sukumar Ray's own language was so contemporary, was so in keeping with his time, that perhaps it is only fair that any new generation of readers should get a version that is at least closer to their own language, if not necessarily being faddish or trendy or absolutely modern. So that was the impulse behind translating Hojaborolo. The tougher part, of course, was to get into that same madcap mood that must have led Sukumar Rai to produce such a work. But I want to step back for a minute and just talk a little bit about Sukumar Rai himself. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, so this may be known history to you. But nevertheless, I think it is important for me to acknowledge who he was. And Kolkata and Bengali culture, of course, is revered for its famous families. There are many first families in every field. There's a first family of cinema, there's a first family of cricket, there's a first family of literature, and of course, then above all, there is the first family of all first families, which is the Ray family. Because if you look at their family tree, you will be hard put to finding someone who is not a brilliant writer or artist or filmmaker. It's extraordinary. As we grew up, we discovered writers who we did not know were part of the family, who inevitably turned out to belong to it. Leela Mojumdar, of course. Shukolata Rao was another. I had no idea that Shukolata Rao was part of this family till much later. And there were many others. To think of Sukumar Ray himself, while, so let me tell you a little bit about how my familiarity with Sukumar Ray and Hojaborolo and some of the other works came about. Many people ask me, or many interviewers ask, so is this a children's book? Is this an adult's book? And what I tell them is that for me, Sukumar Rai is not a writer at all. He was a part of my life from the time that I have any memories of, because people around me, without my knowing it then, would constantly be quoting him. I just did not know that they were quoting Sukumar Rai. I thought it was part and parcel of the Bengali language. And for example, and inevitably, and this is something I do even now 50 years later, which is that I identify people I meet as a Sukumar Rai character in my head. I don't tell them, but straight away I slot them as somebody I've met in a Sukumar Rai book or a poem. So for example, I meet head officer Bodo Babu all the time. লোকটি বেজায় শান্ত তার যেমন মাথার ব্যামো কেউ কখনো জানতো দিব্যি ছিলেন খোশ মেজা যে চেয়ার খানি চেপে. So head officer Bodo Babu is everywhere. You run into them all over the place. But the one character whom my family, who were my mother's side of the family, who were extremely cutting about most people, they held a very high opinion of themselves clearly, and they did not believe in being kind to anyone, would often refer to many people as Nada. And they would say, Dekachis, Nada. And I would, knowing the meaning of the word, it did not make sense to me because the person in question inevitably had a head full of hair. So I would then ask, Nada, what do you mean by Nada? Nada kano bolcho? And they would say, tu bujhbi na. So then eventually I persisted and pestered, and then they explained to me that a Nada refers to a person who tries to thrust themselves into the limelight when no one is really asking them to do any such thing. They're not interested in this person, but Nada wants to be center stage. Now, I'm sure 50% of the people in our lives are like that. As you can see, I've inherited some of that unkindness from my mother's side. So I then asked, who is this Nada? And then Nada, they explained to me, was a character from Hojaborolo, where if you remember, Nada out of nowhere suddenly thrusts himself on our narrator, who is all of 8 years old, and says, না ভাই এখন আমায় গাইতে বলো না, আজকে আমার গলা তেমন খুলবে না. At which point the narrator looks annoyed. I mean, who's asking you to sing? Who even asked you to get in here? And then he says, রাগ করলে, হ্যাঁ ভাই রাগ করলে, and so on. So you can straight away see that it is very, very tempting to find real life equivalents of Sukumar Rai characters all along. So it was only a few years later, at the age of about 7 or 8, that I found out that all this came from books, that these were not actually real life people, although they were, of course. And then I managed to start reading them, Hojaborolo first, then being precocious, I read the plays, Cholochitto Chanchori, and all the others. But Chalachitra Chanchori has stuck with me, and even now, Sanghamitra, my wife, and I, and our closest friends, we perpetually quote lines from Chalachitra Chanchori to one another. So what I'm trying to get at is that Sukumara is very much an integral part of my and my closest friends' lives, perhaps in a way that even Satyajit Ray is not. In the sense that Satyajit Ray is someone whose films we admire and we watch occasionally or time to time, and we talk about them. But Sukumara, we evoke constantly. Not a day goes by when in some fashion or the other he does not become part of our conversation. And we always comment on the fact that if you take his lines, they will inevitably, you will find something that is relevant to the current situation in India and the world. There'll be something that will appear to be a comment on what is going on, and you think he's here right now. One of his characters is talking about it. So this was Sukumara. I mean, I'm an atheist, but if ever there were to be a God in the universe, for me, it would be him. It would not be anyone else. Most of all because of his light touch. The fact that he could tell such great truths with such a fantastic light touch that, he left you laughing till you realized how deep he really was. Now, this man, he was born in 1887. He was born, his father was Upendra Kishore Raichaudhuri, and many of us have seen that famous house in Gorpar in North Calcutta where they lived. There's a Durga Puja close by. Upendra Kishore Raichaudhuri was at the forefront of the Renaissance in Bengali literature and arts and culture that was to come around the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Very interestingly, like his father, Sukumara himself also straddled the world of science, art, and technology quite effortlessly, in the sense that on the one hand, he was a writer, an artist, and as we know, a remarkable artist if you look at his drawings. He was also talking about photography. He was one of the pioneers of photography in India and in Bengal. He gave serious lectures and wrote monographs on the technique of production of photography, of not only of shooting, but also of printing photographs and block making, which is part of printing. So Upendra Kishore Rai and Sukumara both were at the forefront of printing technology. Sukumar himself was a graduate in the sciences, and he went on to write and do a great many other things. And it is extraordinary to imagine that this man died at the age of 36 in the year 1923. He was I think he was flowering. And can you imagine where he would have gone had we not lost him at the age of 36? Of course, Satyajit Ray was born by then, so I suppose we should be grateful for that. But the fact is that we lost him very, very early. And I dare say that the world of Bangla Sahitya and Bangla Shilpo, both literature and art, would have been quite different had Sukumara even lived as long as his son did. He would have produced a great many more things and some remarkable things at that. So at this point, I am going to just break into an example of the kind of thing that he wrote with such extraordinary ease. So I'm going to read you a little bit in Bangla, and if you feel it is necessary, I will read you a translation which I have. So this is from one of his plays. If you will indulge me a moment, I'll just locate it and read it for you. Yes, here we go. So this is from the play Jalapala. It's a very short passage where a singer named Kebolcha Dostad is singing. I'm not going to attempt to sing it, so I'm just going to recite the lines. So Kebolcha is singing. Imagine a tune to this. Haire sonar bharot duddoshagrosto hoilo, অবসাদ হিমে ডুবিয়ে ডুবিয়ে ধুলায় পতিত রইল, যে দেশে শ্রেষ্ঠতার এত সব ভুরি ভুরি প্রমাণ বর্তমান, আজকাল তাকেই কিনা সব অবজ্ঞা করিতেছে এবং দেখাচ্ছে সবাই মর্তমান। কোথা সেই 30 কোটি 98 লক্ষ 14,500 মাতৃভক্ত ভারত সন্তান, সহ্য হবে না তাদের হৃদয়, সবাই জাগো জাগো উঠে পড়ে লাগো, দেশোদ্ধারে ব্রতী হও হে। Whereupon Duliram says, এই সিরিশাস। পণ্ডিত, হ্যাঁ কি বললে? রাজদ্রোহ সূচক, হ্যাঁ? খেটুরাম, তবে রে সিরিশাস গান করছিস কেন রে? দুলিরাম, জানিস আমার মামাতো ভাই গভর্নমেন্টের চাকরি করে। খেটুরাম, হ্যাঁ রে, ওর মামাতো ভাইয়ের চাকরি ঘোচাবি কেন রে? কেবল, আমি তো জানতুম নে। পণ্ডিত, জানতি নে কি রে? কেন জানতি নে? প্রহার। কেবল, কি মারলি কেন রে? ফের মার দেখি। পুনঃ প্রহার। এবার মারবি তো একেবারে পুনঃপ্রহার, এত জোরে মারলি কেন রে স্টুপিড, দাঁড়া দেখাচ্ছি, পলায়ন। So that's Sukumar Rai for you. Do you need an English translation? Does everyone get it in Bangla? We're good, right? Yeah. So as you can see, and I don't know how many people could rhyme bortoman with mortoman for kola to indicate the kola dekhache. It's so redolent of something that the American poet Ogden Nash did later on, but Sukumar Rai was there first. So that's him. And as you can see, he wrote this more than 100 years ago. And if you're reading it now, it feels like it's written right now, that it has not dated at all in any way whatsoever. So that is the genius of the man, where he wrote in a way that could talk across generations to everybody in the same way. Now, if we look at, I don't need to analyze or explain any of this, but if you look at the lines carefully, you can clearly see the satire that lies underneath. On the one hand, he's mocking the quote, the singer. He is mocking this Pundit person who is there by virtue of no real panditry, but has somehow managed to inveigle himself into that position. And then you have these two hangers-on, Duliram and Kheturam, who are just yes men basically to the Jomidar. And at the same time, they are and the government they're talking about, it is the British government. So there is no spirit of Swadeshi in any of them. So you can clearly see the satire that is indicated at contemporary Bengali society of his time. And this is in fact something that he did all the time. If you look at his play Cholochitto Chonchori, it is believed to be a parody, a setup of the Brahmo Samaj, the Brahmo Samaj to which he himself belonged. So, that is fantastic. Here is a person who is a Brahmo, who is himself satirizing the sanctity of the society and the setup that he belongs to. And in fact, there is a lot of, there are rumors, shall we say, that one of the characters in there is meant to be Rabindranath himself when they refer to somebody's ashram. So I'm going to, with your permission, read you a little bit of that as well, because I can never resist this. This is the beginning of Cholochitto Chonchori. Let me just look at this. Give me a moment. Yes, here we are. Srikhondo Dever Ashram. Shammo Siddhanto Sabagriho. Ishan Babu এক কোণে বসিয়া সঙ্গীত রচনায় ব্যস্ত, জনার্দন তাহারই নিকটে উপবিষ্ট। সোমপ্রকাশ খুব মোটা মোটা দু তিনটি কেতাব লইয়া তাহারই একটাকে মন দিয়া পড়িতেছে, এমন সময় মাল্য হস্তে নিকুঞ্জের প্রবেশ। জনার্দন: আচ্ছা, শ্রীখণ্ড বাবুরা কেউ এলেন না কেন বলুন দেখি। নিকুঞ্জ: শুনলাম ঈশান বাবু নাকি ওদের কি ইনসাল্ট করেছেন। ঈশান: কিরকম ইনসাল্ট করলাম, কিরকম? একটা কথা বললেই হলো। এই জনার্দন বাবুই সাক্ষী ছিলেন, কোথায় ইনসাল্ট হলো তা উনি বলুন। জনার্দন: ওই তেমন তো কিছু বলা হয়নি, খালি স্বার্থপর মর্কট বলা হয়েছিল। তা ওরা যেমন অসহিষ্ণু ব্যবহার করছিলেন, তাতে ওরকম বলা কিছুই অন্যায় হয়নি। সোমপ্রকাশ: আর যদি ইনসাল্ট করেই থাকে তাতেই বা কি? তার জন্য কি এইটুকু সাম্যভাব ওদের থাকবে না, যে হৃদ্যতার সঙ্গে পরস্পরের সঙ্গে মিলতে পারেন? ঈশান: তা তো বটেই, কিন্তু ওই যে ওরা একটি দল পাকিয়েছেন, তাতেই ওদের সর্বনাশ করেছে। জনার্দন: অন্তত আজকের মতো এইরকম একটা দিনেও কি ওরা দলাদলি ভুলতে পারেন না? সোমপ্রকাশ: যাই বলুন, এই সম্বন্ধে একজন পাশ্চাত্য দার্শনিক পণ্ডিত যা বলেছেন, আমারও সেই মত। আমি বলি, ওরা না এসেছেন, ভালোই হয়েছে। And so on. So, you can read these lines over and over again. And then in this entire play, he introduces a character named Bhabadulal, who inadvertently shows up everybody's hypocrisies. There is this one brilliant part where somebody says, Bhabadulal says, talking about one of these characters, ওরা জিজ্ঞেস করছিলেন যে নিকুঞ্জ বাবু কোনজন, ছাগলদারি না ডাবা হুঁকো? তো নিকুঞ্জ বাবু খুব রেগে গিয়ে says, আপনি কি বললেন? And he says, আমি বললাম ডাবা হুঁকো। You can just see where he was getting at. So this was Sukumar Rai for you. And when Sukumar Rai wrote anything, it was always a send-up. It was never just, pure humor for the heck of it. He was always poking fun at somebody and pointing out their weaknesses and their foibles and so on. So I imagine that, and unfortunately these things are not documented properly, but I imagine that when he wrote Hojabara, while he was structurally, he was clearly inspired by Alice in Wonderland, which itself is a text that has lent itself to great adult analysis, including a superbly annotated edition by the mathematician and columnist Martin Gardner, who's annotated both Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass with extensive notes that point out references to, among other things, quantum physics and so on, showing how far the writer's own knowledge went. He was, of course, a mathematician. Charles Ludwig Dodson or Lewis Carroll was himself a mathematician. Anyway, so just like Alice in Wonderland was written by a multifarious talent, so was Hojaborolo. So it is tempting and perhaps not futile to actually try and read Hojaborolo as a send-up of many of the things that were happening around that time. I'm not going to attempt that task, but I think that it is impossible to read it purely as a book for children. In fact, children enjoy it for certain reasons, but as adults, we enjoy it even more. And the older we get, we seem to find it even better and even juicier and even funnier. So I'm going to read a little bit both of the Bangla original and then in translation, if that's all right, and then I'll talk about it a little. But before that, I wanted to also just hark back to the fact that, you know, I was talking about Sukumara dying at the age of 36. I just want to bring you to the last poem that he wrote before he died. Here is a man who is dying and he knows that he is dying. And even on his deathbed, he is writing. And he is writing not with any kind of great pathos or tragedy or anything. And this poem of his, which is called Abul Tabul, which begins, মেঘমুলুকে ঝাপসা রাতে রামধনুকে রাপ ছায়াতে তাল বেতালে খেয়াল সুরে তান ধরেছি কণ্ঠপুরে হেথায় নিষেধ নাইরে দাদা নাইরে বাঁধন নাইরে বাধা হেথায় রঙিন আকাশতলে স্বপ্ন দোলা হাওয়ায় দোলে, and so on he goes. And then towards the end he says, মক্ষীরানী পক্ষীরাজ দস্যি ছেলে লক্ষ্মী আজ আদিমকালের চাদিম হিম তোরায় বাঁধা ঘোড়ার ডিম ঘনিয়ে এলো ঘুমের ঘোর গানের পালা সাঙ্গ মোর. It's extraordinary to think that a man writes these lines, Ghoniye lo ghumer ghor ganer pala shango mor, when he knows that he is not going to be able to write anymore, when he's not going to live. And I just want to read out these last 4 lines in Shukanto Chaudhuri's brilliant translation, which also, I think Shukanto da proved that even Sukumar Rai could be translated. That I think was perhaps the most extraordinary thing. So he starts his translation with these lines. On hazy nights among the clouds, through moonlit veils and rainbow shroud, with crazy rhyme and puckish note, I sing my song with open throat. And then the last 4 lines. A keen primordial lunar chill, the nightmares nest with bunchy frill. My drowsy brain such glimpses steep, and all my singing ends in sleep. And all my singing ends in sleep. That was Sukumar Rai. But I dare say that he was laughing all the way through. I can't imagine him in any other mode at all. So, Hojaborolo. So this is the bit about the aforementioned Nadra. We are just ending up with Hiji Beach Beach. So I'll read a little bit of that and then segue straight into Nadra. হিজি বিচ বিচটা এতক্ষণ পড়ে পড়ে ঘুমোচ্ছিল, হঠাৎ ছাগলটার বিকট কান্না শুনে সে হাউমাউ করে ধর্মরিয়ে ওঠে, বিষম টিসমকে একেবারে অস্থির। আমি ভাবলাম বোকাটা মরে বুঝি এবার, কিন্তু একটু পরেই দেখি সে আবার তেমনি হাত পা ছুড়ে ফ্যাক ফ্যাক করে আসতে লেগেছে। আমি বললাম এর মধ্যে আবার হাসার কি হলো? সে বলে সে একজন লোক ছিল, সে মাঝে মাঝে এমন ভয়ঙ্কর নাক ডাকতো যে সবাই তার উপর চটা ছিল। একদিন তাদের বাড়ি বাজ পড়েছে আর অমনি সবাই দৌড়ে তাকে দমাদম মারতে লেগেছে। ও আমি বললাম যত সব বাজে কথা। এই বলে যেই ফিরতে গেছি অমনি চেয়ে দেখি একটা ন্যাড়া মাথা কে যেন যাত্রার জুড়ির মতো চাপকান আর পায়জামা পরে হাসি হাসি মুখ করে আমার দিকে তাকিয়ে আছে। দেখে আমার গা জ্বলে গেল। And this line, দেখে আমার গা জ্বলে গেল, is so much our reaction to so many things that happen around us. It's like, it's my sort of default reaction to most things these days. দেখে গা জ্বলে গেল। আমায় ফিরতে দেখেই সে আবদার করে আল্লাদির মতো ঘাড় বাঁকিয়ে দুহাত নেড়ে বলতে লাগলো, না ভাই, না ভাই, এখন আমায় গাইতে বলো না, সত্যি বলছি আজকে আমার গলা তেমন খুলবে না। আমি বললাম কি আপদ, কে তোমায় গাইতে বলেছে? লোকটা এমন বেহায়া, সে তবু আমার কানে কাছে ঘ্যান ঘ্যান করতে লাগলো, রাগ করলে? হ্যাঁ ভাই রাগ করলে? আচ্ছা না কয়েকটা গান শুনিয়ে দিচ্ছি, রাগ করবার দরকার কি ভাই? আমি কিছু বলার আগেই ছাগলটা আর হিজি বিচ বিচটা একসঙ্গে চেঁচিয়ে উঠলো, হ্যাঁ গানক গানক। অমনি নাড়াটা তার পকেট থেকে মস্ত 2 তারা গানের কাগজ বের করে সেগুলো চোখের কাছে নিয়ে গুনগুন করতে করতে হঠাৎ সরু গলায় চিৎকার করে গান ধরলো, লাল গানে নীল সুর, হাসি হাসি গন্ধ। ওই একটি মাত্র পদ সে একবার গাইলো, 2 বার গাইলো, 5 বার 10 বার গাইলো। আমি বললাম এ তো ভারী উৎপাত দেখছি, গানের কি আর কোনো পদ নেই? এরা বললো আছে, কিন্তু সেটা অন্য একটা গান। সেটা হচ্ছে অলিগলি চলিরাম ফুটপাতে ধুমধাম কালি দিয়ে চুনকাম। সে গান আজকাল আমি গাই না। আরেকটা গান আছে নাইনিতালের নতুন আলু, সেটা খুব নরম সুরে গাইতে হয়, সেটাও আজকাল গাইতে পারি না। আজকাল যেটা গাই সেটা হচ্ছে সিকি পাকার গান। And so on he goes. I'm just going to find this portion. So here we are. So this Huzz Buzz Buzz, which is what which is called in this version, Huzz Buzz Buzz. Huzz Buzz Buzz had been dozing all this time, but he woke up suddenly on hearing the goat's monstrous wailing, shot to his feet and almost choked himself. I honestly thought the fool was going to kick the bucket. But just a few moments later, he was thrashing about again, laughing his guts out. What's so funny now? I asked. He said, there was this man. He used to snore so loudly sometimes that everyone was perpetually annoyed with him. One day, his house was struck by lightning and everyone began to beat him up. Ha ha. I said, is there no end to your garbage? And I just turned around when I found someone dressed like a singer in a tunic and tight pajamas, his head shaven, smirking at me. The very sight of him irritated me no end. When he realized I had seen him, he cocked his head with a smarmy expression and said, waving his arms, oh no, my friend, oh no, do not ask me to sing now. I swear on all that I hold dear, my voice will not cooperate with me today. I said, don't be a pest. Who asked you to sing? But he was so shameless, he continued whining next to my ears. Are you upset? Oh, my dear friend, are you upset? All right, then, I shall sing a few songs for you. There is no need to be upset, my dearest friend, none at all. Before I could protest, both the goat and that Hizbaz shouted, yes, let's have some songs. At once, Shavenhead pulled out 2 fat sheets of paper from his pocket, held them close to his eyes and hummed for a few moments before belting out a line in a loud and high voice. Red song, blue tune, the smiling kind of smell. Red song, blue tune, the smiling kind of smell. He sang that one line once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. I said, this is grating on my nerves. Doesn't your song have any other lines? Shavenhead replied, it does, but that's a different song. That one goes, dancing down the lane, pavement food is plain, whitewashed with rain. I do not sing it these days. There's another one, Tender Nuts from Nainital. You have to sing it very mildly. I cannot sing this one either at present. The one that I do sing is the Shifty Sharks song. And so he goes on. Just in case you want to know what Nadra looks like. Yeah, that's him. Sorry. Just trying to, can you see him? Or is the light not there? There he is. That's Nadra in Sukumar's original illustration. And don't you feel like slapping him the moment you see him? Do it upward on the spot. So you can see that the tone of Hojoborala, which although is a very short text, it's barely about 6,000 or 7,000 words, is actually almost manic. It's very high energy. Things are happening continuously. There's no pause. There are characters jumping in and all the time saying absurd things. And the whole sense of absurdity about it is very high, and yet it is told in a completely serious voice. There is no obvious attempt at being funny or cracking jokes or anything. It's the content itself that makes it funny. So when translating it, I realized that it would not work to be in a calm frame of mind, shall we say. And I don't know what frame of mind Sukumara used to be able to produce these things almost continuously and with such felicity. But I felt that I had to get myself into this absurd state of mind myself and start thinking of everything as weird, out of this world. Nothing is real, nothing is serious. And it's not easy to it's not easy to get into that mode really when we live in the world that we do. So to do that, I did 2 things as preparation really. I read a lot of Sukumara loudly to myself to get into that mode. And I read a lot of P.G. Wodehouse. I read Wodehouse just to get into that sense of absurdity and realize that how perfect, these characters are perfectly serious about their own world. But when we read it, we realize how funny it all is. And so I think that in some way got me into a mode where one afternoon, I felt that, okay, I think now's the time, let's go for it. And pretty much in a space of about 8 to 9 hours with just breaks for food, I did the first draft. I felt that if I gave up halfway, I would never be able to return to it. I did the first draft and I felt that I would take some risks, in the sense that I would try to make some references that might be more that are anachronistic, in the sense that references to things that did not exist in Sukumari's time when the book was written, but that would perhaps make sense to audiences today. And I did that knowing that it was a risk, but at the same time I felt that it would be in the spirit of things. Had Sukumara written today, he might have well invoked such things. Of course, there was no way of confirming that, but as I said, it was a reckless attempt to begin with. So one of the most interesting aspects of this was naming the characters, because they all have such evocative names. So let me talk about the title. The title itself was quite interesting, because I really, earlier versions have talked about, tried to focus on the fact that Hoja Borolo means nonsense. Now, I don't even know in terms of etymology whether Hoja Borolo means nonsense because this book is called Hoja Borolo, or whether it meant nonsense to begin with and then became the title of the book. I really don't know. I suspect it could be the former. I wouldn't be surprised if the book lent itself to the term becoming a synonym for nonsense. But I felt that just calling it a topsy-turvy world or nonsense and so on wouldn't work, because I wanted that sound. And then I discovered that, my God, it's right there. The law of Bangla is also law in English, and that is exactly what is taking place in the book. There is a case being fought right there. So it fell into place immediately for me. I said, this law obviously has to be the same law, because it's a legal case. And then I started playing with the sound, and I, of course, jobor, or jobor, I realized jobor is very close to jabber, which is what everybody is doing. Everybody is jabbering endlessly. So jabber and law fell into place. I was still stuck on the haw, and that is where my editor Shudeshna pitched in, and she came up with haber to rhyme with jabber. So, it had the perfect ring, haber jabber law, and it also allowed us one word that did not have any meaning, which also I think was important, given that it is in itself, the phrase doesn't mean anything. So it became haber jabber law, and that had it rolled off the tongue nicely. So I think we kind of accepted it right away. So among the risks that I took, for example, is the name in English I use for Gecho Dada is Bitri Bro. Now, bro, of course, is a very modern word, and it's a word that I hear all the time from my students at the university. But I just felt Bitri Bro has that weird but modern ring to it that might work. Some of the place names I changed from being merely in Bengal to being an all India kind of map, again, to make those who are reading in English feel a little more at home. So I used places like Ullasnagar, Mangaluru, and Raipur, which are kind of, they sound similar, close to the original names. Similarly, the famous line, Tibbete Rasta to Kubshoja, Kolkata, Ranaghat. So I changed that to Calcutta, Dibrugarh, Rimbuk, and Tibet. Again, just to give it a more sort of all India route, as it were. Then I had a lot of mental thought about what to name Udo and Budo, because again, Udo and Budo are words so essentially Bengali. I didn't want to give up the sound, but I also wanted it to be weird. So I eventually ended up with Uto and Buto, who sound similar but also have a slightly wider kind of reference. And then, most interestingly, I was stuck for a long time with Bakaran Singh BA. Bakaran Singh BA was quite a challenge, because I wanted to somehow do something absurd and at the same time keep the reference. And, just calling him something like Grammar Singh and so on did not seem to me to be funny enough. Maybe it would have been okay, but I wanted something more. So eventually, when I was, actually the name came to me over dinner for some reason. And the name that came to me was Renan Barton Singh BA. And the ba, instead of the ma, came from his ba sound. So Renan Barton Singh. And of course, as we know, Renan Martin has been very much a part of our lives as far as grammar is concerned. So I thought, let me throw this in. Maybe not everybody will get it, but those who get it will have a quiet chuckle of their own, and the rest maybe will ask more. So yeah, that's how it went. I would also like to just read one of the, as you know, the book is also full of poetry. It's got a lot of rhymes in it. Some of them are nonsense rhymes, of course. So when you're translating nonsense rhyme, obviously you have to stick to the spirit of it much more than the letter of it. You can't take each and every word and translate it. You have to keep the rhyme. You have to keep the fact that they add up. Each image is coherent, but if you add up the images, they mean nothing at all. So there was Akit Pithe Dui, Choki Chepe Shui, Shanbadano Bhui, Ilish Magur Rui, Gamcha Dal Ki Jole Dhui, Kandish Kano Tui. So this became 1 + 1 is 2. I think I've lost a shoe. A ghost is saying boo. Let's all go to the zoo. Make some catfish stew. The sky looks very blue. Got some gum to chew. Fill the cup with glue. Have you got the flu? So that was the idea, to keep the rhymes going, to keep the sense of absurdity going, and so on. Now the book is out and I'm very, very nervous. The print edition has only just been sort of, one copy has been delivered to me. It came out originally on the Kindle because of the lockdown, when they couldn't produce printed copies and get them across to bookshops. But now that things are opening up, they're saying that they'll have the book out in stores by the end of the month. And now my nervousness starts, because so there are two kinds of nervousnesses here. One from people who know Bangla and who will tear it apart or say that, okay, we'll accept this. And one from those who've heard of Sukumara and will be reading him over here and then might either say, what's the big deal? Or, oh, okay, fine. Now I know why you guys rave so much about him. So I'm on tenterhooks, and I'm just going to stop here because I've spoken more than enough. So thank you very much for listening patiently all this time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Arunava. It was very nice listening to all this. And the floor is now open for questions. If you would like, any of you would like to ask him a question, please type it in the chat box, which is just below, at the center of the screen below, and I will read out the questions to Arunava to answer. Did you have to take any permission for translating this, or no?
No,
it
so
isn't covered by copyright.
Yeah. So Indian rules are that 60 years after an author's death, their work goes out of copyright.
Oh.
So yeah, both Sukumar Rai and Upendra Kishore Rai Chaudhary's works are out of copyright now.
Right. Any questions, anybody?
Or you could unmute everyone and just...
No, there is a question from Vikram Bose. Any plans of translating Rajshekhar Parashuram?
Actually, yes, he's been translated, by the way, and he's been translated by the same person I mentioned, Shukanto Chaudhary and Polash Baron Pal together. But his works also go out of copyright, are out of copyright. In fact, they went out of copyright this year because he died in 1959. So I do hope to translate some of his works, yes. And that is going to be another huge test. Perhaps an even bigger test, because his language is nowhere near as simple as Sukumar Rai's.
But I'm sure you'll do a great job of it.
Thank you for the vote of confidence.
Right, now, yes.
Arunava, 7 dugune 14. তার 4 হাতে রইল pencil. How did that sort of strike you, and what was your rendition of it, if you could?
The rendition, sure, I'll tell you. The rendition is nothing special, but I think I mean, that line is legendary in our heads, right? And it is very, very worrying, because that kind of line, I don't know if it can evoke the same thing. So I kept it simple, because Shadugune Choddo in itself is a very simple line. So I think whatever the fun in it comes from the context. So I just had him ask, that was that. I sat down on a rock beneath the tree, and at once someone said hoarsely, 7 2s are. This now. I was looking around in search of the voice when it came again. Why don't you answer? 7 2s are, and so on.
How did you illustrate your book, Arunava? Are there illustrations in your book?
Yes. The original illustrations have been included.
Okay.
So, for example, as you
question from Dhruv Khaitan.
Yeah.
Is there a message in the nonsense, or is nonsense itself the message?
Yeah, great question. I personally feel that the nonsense itself is the message, because when the world around you is absurd, I don't think you can talk about it in any way except in terms that would be described as nonsense, right? and somehow the world around us right now is so absurd that sometimes it seems to me that nonsense is the only language that you can use for it. Truth is, as Jotayu said in Satyajit Ray's novels, truth is stronger than fiction.
Question from Sumit Chatterjee. How about translating abul tabul?
You know, as I said, Shukanto Da has done that so brilliantly that there is really no need to do another version. I mean, I would just urge everyone to pick up his translations. They're absolutely fabulous.
Question from Anirban Purakasto. From recent research, it is learned that Ray was actually taunting the VC, Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, while Ray was participating in a students' movement. Any such parallel in Hojoborolo?
I'll have to check now that you mention it, whether there's a VC type character. There are lots of authority figures in Hojoborolo, certainly. I don't know if any of them stand for Sir Ashutosh, but thank you for that. I will find out. I will certainly find out.
Question from Dr. Orkodev Chatterjee. Have you translated any of Sharat Chandra's works? I know you have, but you'll give a fuller reply.
Actually, just one of his short stories, Mohesh. I haven't translated any of his novels. But I'm tempted to. But I'm tempted to also translate them in a way that brings them to modern readers in a different way, because he's traditionally associated with being very lachrymose and highly sentimental and so on. And he was nothing of the kind as a person. So I think his novels need to be read differently, perhaps. So maybe one day I'll try to do that.
Question from Sumit Ray. As a translator from Bengali to English, what is the greatest challenge that you face to keep the nuance and sense of the original work intact?
Well, many. For example, Bangla and English have originated in two entirely different cultural systems. So there are many things that happen when you live a life in Bangla that have no equivalent. And I don't mean the language alone. I mean that there are many actions and emotions and cultural constructs that do not exist for those who live in the English language. I'll give you one classic example. In বাংলা সহানুভূতি দেখানোর জন্য আমরা লোকেদের গায়ে হাত বুলিয়ে দিই, বিশেষ করে তারা যদি আমাদের থেকে ছোট হয়. But in English, if you try to translate this gesture, it will be extremely creepy. If you say that they ran their fingertips lightly over the other person's skin or brow or arm or whatever, it's going to be looked upon as sexual assault. So, this is the kind of thing that actually poses the greatest challenge. When you don't want to reduce an action to just a sentiment, but at the same time, you need a corresponding kind of action which will not make the reader freak out. That's one challenge. A second challenge, of course, is that the two languages are very different in their vocabularies. Again, another classic example is that there are more than a dozen words for moon in Bangla, and all of them are liberally used by writers. And all of them translate into moon in English. So you lose that entire, that range, that spectrum, and so on. Then there's one word which always defeats me, which is moan, which is a sort of combination of mind and heart, right? When we say moan, we are not referring to either the mind or the heart, but a unique combination of the two. And depending on the context, sometimes you're 80% mind and 20% heart. Sometimes you're 90% heart and 10% mind. So what do you translate it into? You really need you really don't need a new word. You really need to import moan into the English language and let them learn that this concept is far greater than just mind or heart.
A follow-up question from Sumit Ray. Or the famous line from Kabuliwala, "Kaak ke bolo kaak," in English, crow to crow, never quite captured the essence, did it? And the word Obhiman, is there an English word for it?
Sorry, what's the second part?
And the word Obhiman, is there any English word for it?
No, that's Obhiman is another classic word for which apparently English-speaking people do not have that sentiment. Otherwise, they would have had a word for it, right? Yeah, maybe they just internalize it so much that they cannot wear their hearts on their sleeves and do that. So you sort of render it contextually into hurt or pique or when you're offended or so on. But try to figure out what brand of Obhiman the character is experiencing at that point of time and go somewhere close. What complicates it even further is that Abhiman in Hindi or Sanskrit has a slightly different meaning, although the roots are the same. There it's pride. And Bangla Abhiman, of course, comes from pride, but its manifestation is typically Bengali, right? It's a passive.
Thank you so much for taking this time out for almost an hour or about 45 minutes of some joy in these very troubled times. I will hand over to my colleague in the library committee, Professor Chaitanya Mitra, to give the formal vote of thanks. But I'd like to tell all the members that in a week from now, on the 24th of July, just after the club's AGM at 7:30, we have the very distinguished Professor Prabhat Patnaik speaking. So that's in a week from now, but that will be at 7:30 rather than the usual 7. Chaitanya, would you like to take over from here?
Yes. Yes, if someone unmutes, yes.
Yeah, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. All the members and the chairman of the library subcommittee of the Bengal Club join me to thank Professor Arunava Sinha for giving us this delightful evening with a peep in the nonsense world of Hojabara law and reminding us, especially in the question answer session, that nothing can be judged in face values. I was reminded of the last line of the first poem of Abul Tabul, Aire tobe bhuler bhabe asambhaber chandete. So if we link up the wonderful talk of Professor Sinha and the rhymes of Shajaru, Mojaru, and Kangaroo in Hojabara law, and the present times in which we all are helpless, laughter in any particular form would be rejuvenating. And that is exactly what he tried to do. Thank you, Professor Sinha, and thank you, the audience.
Thank you very much for having me this evening.
So good evening and goodbye. Thank you all for that. And thank you again, Arunava.
Thank you, everyone.